When it comes to protecting the free world, no one does it better than the United States. For decades, the U.S. Navy has been moving through the oceans, serving as the silent protectors of world peace. But such a Navy needs men. Men who can endure months of deployment aboard what can only be described as a city at sea. Yes, we are talking about the pride of the United States Navy, one of 11 powerful aircraft carriers that often patrol the vast oceans of the world. But what is it like for these troops to live aboard this vessel, and how are the living conditions? Are these troops fed and treated correctly? And how often do they get to spend some time at home? This is a city at sea. What it is like, living on a United States aircraft carrier. Currently, the United States Navy fields two types of aircraft carriers. The first is the more popular Nimitz class, which has a length just shy of 1,100 feet, containing a 134-foot beam and a little over 250 feet for the flight deck. Its displacement is around 97,000 tons, and it can reach a top speed of just over 30 knots, while containing enough firepower to level a small city. Once the United States needed something a little better, the more advanced and newer Gerald R. Ford class was designed. It is similar in length, give or take about 5 feet, while having a similar-sized beam and flight deck. But where it differs is the use of the two new Bechtel A-1B nuclear reactors, which serves as a power source for the vessel. This is slightly more powerful than the two Westinghouse A-4W nuclear reactors found on the Nimitz class of these vessels. Both these vessels have the same top speed and can hold about 90 aircraft. But it is the armaments of these vessels that make them extremely powerful. Sea Sparrow missiles, rolling airframe missiles, RAM, and the Phalanx CIWS are some of the most intimidating weapons you can find. But if you are more interested in weaponry, we recommend that you check out our video on what it costs the U.S. Navy to fire this equipment. Nevertheless, the aircraft carrier is the absolute pride of the United States Navy, and it is the centerpiece of every single major fleet. In fact, aircraft carriers usually move in what is called a carrier strike force. This is similar to a fleet of naval vessels and can be up to 12 vessels that surround the carrier as a way of protecting it. The United States Navy loves to rely on destroyers, submarines, and when closer to shore, a few patrol boats might also be deployed for protection. But if it has so much firepower, why would it need such excessive protection? Well, it's actually simple. Despite all the firepower this vessel brings to the table, it is still extremely vulnerable to attacks from other vessels. Should any nation send a submarine, it could do serious damage unless the vessel is protected. Or you could find yourself with a similar situation to Pearl Harbor. Numerous kamikaze drones, as they would be today, will absolutely destroy an aircraft carrier, striking before it can ready its defenses. Yes, the Phalanx will surely cause some damage, but an aircraft carrier relies heavily on getting aircraft in the sky. And if the flight deck gets damaged, this can be almost impossible. For this reason, a carrier strike group is often deployed to escort the aircraft carrier, and together, these vessels have unrivaled firepower, which could theoretically destroy a small city. To put this into perspective, only recently, the United States deployed two vessels, the USS Carl Vinson and USS Harry S. Truman, to the Red Sea. As the Houthis were attacking innocent vessels passing by and trying to take out anything Israel sent, it was needed to bring a stop to these opportunistic attacks. The United States easily deployed these carriers, each with about 90 aircraft, conducting daily missions flying over Yemen. They would deliver tons of ordnance, including the JDAM, completely destroying weaponry the Houthis had been using to attack other vessels in the region. Just 2 months later, and the Houthis had slowly stopped these attacks, understanding exactly what the consequences are of going toe-to-toe with the United States. Perhaps the stationing of 6 B-2 Spirit bombers at the joint military base, Diego Garcia would also play a big role in reducing tension with the Houthis in the Red Sea. Moreover, these vessels are currently also staring down Iran, and should a nuclear deal not be reached between the two nations, it is very likely that F-18 fighters deployed aboard these vessels will want to enter Iranian airspace. But this is exactly why we have decided to make this video. You always see the news and admire these majestic vessels, but when it comes to the onboard antics and what the sailors need to endure, no one really cares. In fact, everyone wants to win a war or skirmish, and then simply just continue with their lives, never talking about any of those on board. For these sailors, the 9 to 12 months spent at sea can be absolutely treacherous, and many of them sacrifice so much that readjusting to normality after a deployment can be tough. Fortunately, the United States Navy has caught on to this, and they are now trying to make aircraft carriers feel as close to home as possible. While you will not be able to see your favorite landmark when looking out the door of your cabin, the small things that we are about to discuss in this video can quickly give you a feeling that you are not too far from home. This is what it's like for those who spend months at sea aboard the most powerful vessel the world has ever seen. Let's begin with the basics of deployment. Each deployment can last anything from 9 months up to a year, but some sailors can easily find themselves living aboard these vessels for up to 24 months. Yes, certain missions will require a little longer deployment than others, which can stretch these feelings of loneliness out quite a bit longer. Getting a job aboard a U.S. aircraft carrier is very similar to any other vessel, but unfortunately, you rarely have a choice. It all starts with arduous training programs that could last a couple of months before you even get to choose where you want to go. Once the training is finished, a note will be passed out, where sailors can choose where they want to be deployed. This often makes it easier for sailors to remain close to home whenever possible. But simply finishing your training doesn't mean you will deploy to a carrier. You could find yourself deployed to a destroyer or submarine, so luck can also play a big role. Fortunately, you will eventually find a role depending on what your chosen specialization is. Many of those who want to fly aircraft can find themselves as pilots here. But unless you are a pilot, or at least training for one, it is impossible to know exactly where you could end up for deployment. For the captains aboard these vessels, it could be a little different. Finishing your training doesn't automatically mean that you'll be a captain. In fact, every prospective CVN commanding officer is eligible for a deep draft. Again, it means that the captain, even with a desire to work aboard a CVN, could theoretically find themselves working aboard another vessel. However, if the call comes and someone does end up on an aircraft carrier, life changes completely. But since the captain is the most important part of the vessel, we will have a look at how a day in their life can look a little later on. As for the normal sailors, each of them will have some kind of specialization. Some are chefs and culinary specialists, whereas others can operate the flight deck. Depending on your specialty, you will be assigned a task, which you hope is probably aboard one of these massive aircraft carriers. If you are lucky, you will be deployed on the USS Carl Vinson, and for the next few months, you will be at the behest of the United States Navy and the city at sea that it has become known as. But what exactly makes this a city at sea? First of all, an aircraft carrier is absolutely enormous, and some of the biggest can comfortably hold up to 6,000 sailors, all fully trained and ready to fight. In fact, the enthusiasm might be high when you leave port in Florida, but after a few weeks aboard the vessel, it will become stale rather quickly. Depending on your job, you will be divided into shifts, with each sailor responsible for a certain task. Most sailors simply need to ensure the vessel is working and that everything is in the best possible condition. Others might man the weaponry, or even be engineers working on many of these flight decks or even aircraft. Everyone has a job, and the survival of the vessel depends on things going the way they should. Yes, sailors do get a little bit of downtime and leisure when they can have a little bit of fun, but we will get to that in a bit. For now, let's explore what the life of the average sailor would look like aboard one of these vessels. For this example, we will look at two people, a maintenance officer working with the nuclear reactor and a fighter pilot conducting daily missions. First of all, the maintenance officer and the pilot might enjoy the same living quarters. These small cabins can house between 4 and 6 sailors and usually feature bunk beds that stack on top of one another. It is nothing too glamorous and is specifically designed as a way of saving as much space as humanly possible. If they wake up at 5 or 6 a.m., both will usually go to the mess hall or galley where the food is being prepared. Keep in mind that each vessel contains multiple kitchens and dining areas to ensure that every sailor can be fed on time. A warm meal is usually served, and the sailors will get ready for the day. Each will head out to their specific destination. The nuclear engineer will head down to the engine of the vessel, where they will be briefed by the team who is knocking off. Yes, sailors usually work in shifts, taking about 8 hours at a time before shifting. This is not the case for the captain, but you will see this in a moment. The engineer will fulfill their task for the day, with numerous duties, all to ensure the ship is sailing smoothly and that nothing is at risk. Once they finish, they go back to the mess hall for a final meal, and then usually to bed. Yes, there are numerous other activities, and the highly coveted supermarket we will discuss a little later in the video. As for the fighter pilot, they have a little more on their plate to deal with. Once they are done eating, they will also head to the flight deck. Here, pilots work with flight engineers and the control room, with training missions starting as early as 9 a.m. If there are no missions that need to be conducted, the pilots need to fly numerous training sorties, all with the idea of keeping them ready for combat if something happens. As you can imagine, the carrier is constantly filled with the sounds of fighter jets landing or taking off. If it is time for a mission, these pilots will often have to do some patrol around specific areas. It is control missions like these which have helped eliminate a lot of the Houthi top command and often spotted things that satellites can easily miss. The pilot and the aircraft will return to the carrier, using precision skill to land, and then it is job done for the day, or so you might think. Unlike the engineers, the pilots will need to meet at the end of the day to discuss mission reports and do a debrief. This can take another couple of hours out of his day, and by the time it is all said and done, the pilot might find themselves back in bed at around 10 p.m. From internal maintenance in the engine room to cleaning and helping pilots safely take off, these crew members can work up to 16 hours per shift. Unlike the outside world, there's no commute to work and absolutely no place to just step outside and get some fresh air. Well, you can jump on the flight deck, but this is merely just the ocean with hundreds of miles of water around you. Once a sailor finishes his job, many often just head to their sleeping quarters. Stacked 3 levels high, sailors often sleep about 6 in a single room. It is barely big enough for all your personal belongings, but still must work to accommodate the more than 6,000 sailors on board. Aside from the luxury snack items you pack before the trip, the only real food you get is often 3 meals you are fed each day. Well, not that there's anything wrong with this, as these meals are well thought out and specifically tailored to the needs of these hard-working men. But nothing beats the guilty pleasure moments of enjoying that perfect ramen noodle when you return from a hard day down in the boiler room. Fortunately, the United States Navy has got this sorted and included perhaps the biggest portable supermarket drifting across the ocean and giving U.S. naval personnel access to all their favorite treats. Despite it never being the size of a Walmart, these supermarkets are extremely popular, and they offer sailors a host of snacks and some of their favorite American goods. Forgot your toothpaste? No problem. Just hop inside the store to stock up. What about those long shifts? Well, you have hundreds of energy drinks to choose from, and if your headphones might have fallen overboard when the F-18 took off from the flight deck, the local carrier supermarket will have you covered. But space still remains a problem, and unlike Costco, you won't have a shopping trolley. nor will your fellow bunkmates be happy if you bring 3 or 4 bags of groceries. This is why essential products are the main selling items at the supermarket, and it allows sailors to buy what they want instead of having to live off what they get. Instead of that half-baked cracker that doesn't taste like anything, you can buy your own salty snacks and at least have a little bit of home to snack on. But this is not all, and many U.S. aircraft carriers have no problem taking things to the next level. Yes, you can find your favorite coffee shop located right on board the USS Carl Vinson. If you don't like the standard coffee served in the mess hall, just pop into Starbucks and buy your favorite espresso that is sure to shock you into action in the morning. Each person aboard this incredible piece of engineering can find themselves eating whatever it is they are used to back at home. Well, at least most of it. It has had an incredible effect on the overall morale of sailors, allowing each one of them to feel like they are still on U.S. soil, even when traversing the hostile waters of the Taiwan Sea. So, the big question is, what does such a supermarket aboard one of the biggest naval vessels even look like? Is it all talk, and when you enter it, it is nothing more than a vending machine? Or does it have state-of-the-art systems with self-checkout that operates like your favorite Amazon convenience store back home? But we will dissect the supermarket and other amenities a little later on in the video. So let's have a look at how the captain lives aboard one of these vessels. From the moment the captain boards the vessel, they are immediately tasked with making sure the ship is ready for the mission. This involves doing various checks that are usually conducted by naval officers who report back to the captain. As the vessel sets sail, the real work begins, and for the first few days, the only important thing will be preparation and getting to the location where a supposed mission needs to be carried out. It is also around this time that various training missions are launched to ensure all the aircraft are in operating condition. But usually, faulty aircraft will not even be deployed, unless maintenance can be done aboard the vessel. The captain usually wakes up at an early hour. In many cases, this is even before the rest of the crew, even though many sailors will have to work the night shift. As soon as the captain gets up, the executive officers will brief them if something needs to be addressed. However, various administrative tasks and planning for the rest of the day will also commence almost immediately. The captain will have the opportunity to eat, usually in the captain's own dining room, which is completely separate from everyone else. This is also where the captain is briefed about the mission, and many of his naval officers will have already set up schedules for what should happen. Once the commanding officer is done, it is usually time for UNREP or underway replenishment. This is a very critical moment for the ship, and it is usually very vulnerable. A supply vessel will arrive alongside the carrier, and high-tension cables are strung between the two. Cargo is then moved between the two vessels to ensure the carrier has everything it needs to continue the next leg of the journey. Helicopters can be deployed to take care of the heavier equipment, while the captain ensures that every extra resource is accounted for and correctly stored. Usually, flight operations will kick off around the same time. These could either be mission-related or simply training, but pilots need to ensure they are comfortable operating on these somewhat smaller decks. Ordnance and other defense equipment will be checked daily to ensure that everything is in working condition should it be needed for a mission. But what many people forget is that the commanding officer has incredible multitasking skills. They can focus on the flight operations, while also doing many administrative tasks like fueling the aircraft. Many of these officers are also highly trained, even being nuclear engineers who fully understand the inner workings of the vessel and its power source. Since the captain is the one who understands every square inch of an aircraft carrier, they are the one to make the final call. This means that the commanding officer has the full knowledge of exactly what is going on with the ship and can instantly react to any possible problem that arises. By the time the day ends and the captain returns to their quarters, a good 18 or even 19 hours might have already passed, and this means that just a few hours are left for sleep. The big upside is how good the captain's quarters are. Fortunately, the captain's quarters are a little bit different than those of the others, and as we have discussed in a previous video, Many vessels offer the captain two rooms, one which is commonly used for communications and other daily tasks, and the other, which is fairly comfortable. The captain uses one for sleeping, and the other is merely just for administrative purposes. Many captains, like David Crocker, whom we discussed in a previous video, also like to stay in touch with the sailors. He would often choose a standard mess hall for dining and allow many of the sailors to vent their grievances if they happen to have any. It helps the sailors feel like the captain understands their plight and is actually putting in a real effort to keep everyone happy. If the crew isn't happy, the ship itself might not really be functional, and this could lead to further risks from attacks. It all comes down to working as a team and to make sure that no one soldier feels like they are not valued aboard the vessel. Yes, it can be extremely hard to do so when you have more than 6,000 sailors aboard a vessel. To reduce some of the pressure put on the captain, various amenities are added to the ship. Yes, the United States Navy has taken a lot of care to ensure that everyone aboard these vessels are in good spirits. So let's start with the kitchen. Perhaps the heartbeat of an aircraft carrier is the kitchen or galley. Here, culinary professionals work tirelessly to ensure every sailor aboard one of these vessels is fueled for the day. The cooks will wake up at a ridiculous hour in the morning to begin preparing meals for each sailor. A U.S. aircraft is set up very similar to other naval vessels. Numerous cooks will operate in this small space, and their only mission is to ensure that soldiers are fed. Unlike many other institutions, the United States Navy has set menus that often work in conjunction with the ingredients. Cooks will determine the flow of the menus. For example, Mondays might be menu A and BA, while Tuesdays could be menu C and D. Yes, there are usually two set menus for those who don't want what is served on the first. However, many vessels also allow the sailors to choose their menus. This means that the individual can now determine for themselves what they want to eat and which menu should be prepared. Unfortunately, this works best on destroyers or submarines, where the number of people who need to be fed is much lower. Since they operate a cafeteria style of dining, sailors can choose any of these available meals for the day. Unfortunately, this isn't fine dining, and the chances of getting the perfect meal or 5-star Wagyu steak might not be what you get from your menu. One thing a sailor quickly needs to get used to is the fact that these meals are not prepared to taste. Since cooks need to prepare thousands of meals each day, sailors will usually get something generic for the most part. For example, steaks could be cooked to 2 different temperatures, and as a sailor, you will need to decide and choose one of these that meets your needs the best. So, let's look at the average day of a cook as well. These cooks wake up at 3 a.m. each morning before heading to the galley. Once they enter and make sure everything is clean, the food preparation starts. Cooks determine which menus will be available for the day before informing crew members. The ingredients are prepared, and the process of cooking also starts. By the time the first crew members pop in for meals at around 6 a.m., everything is ready to go, and they can simply just give their orders. Instead of waiting the standard 20-minute waiting period you have to endure at your favorite restaurant, these meals are simply just dished up and served to the sailor. It saves everyone a lot of time, and since the galley is small, it offers every sailor the opportunity to have a quick meal before starting their shift. But once the first group of sailors has been fed, it doesn't mean the cooks will now be relieved. Since this process can take a couple of hours, the first meals could only end by 10 or 11 a.m. At this point, everything needs to be cleaned, and the cooks have to start preparing for lunch. Keep in mind that, unlike normal or smaller vessels, the aircraft carrier is essentially a city at sea, and with thousands of hungry sailors, having a single galley and mess hall simply would not do the job. So the Navy has built numerous mess halls and kitchens, and sailors will need to use the one closest to them to ensure that every kitchen cooks the precise number of meals needed. In fact, it can be very disconcerting should any food be wasted. This means that following breakfast, Culinary members of the crew will immediately move on to cooking the next meal. By the time they finish, it is already midday, and sailors again flood the dining area expecting to be fed. Once lunch is over, the exact same process needs to happen again for dinner, while the same cooks who woke up at 3 a.m. are still busy cooking. This is where sailors often complain about working for 12 to 16 hours, and no one truly appreciates them. In fact, many former Navy veterans have come out suggesting that cooks aboard naval vessels are some of the most underappreciated assets. But these are not just mere cooks brought in for the sake of cooking meals. Much like military doctors and dentists, these cooks are also trained soldiers, or naval officers in this case. They are still combat ready and will need to go into combat when called upon. By the time dinner is finished, the cooks can often get off duty, and many will return to the sleeping quarters where they will get a good night's rest before doing the same thing the next day. However, safety standards and scrutiny about excessive working hours have been a big criticism of the Navy. Many of these sailors work almost 16 hours, and this can be seen as absolutely ridiculous when it goes on for months. So, to combat this, many naval vessels rely on shifts, where they allow cooks to work 8 or 10-hour shifts. Vessels like destroyers have smaller crews, which often means that the cooks can take a bit of rest. So, the galley might be open for a specific period during the day, but it shuts down at some point during the day, and this means that those who have not yet eaten might need to search elsewhere. Aboard an aircraft carrier, things are a little bit different, and the ship operates 24 hours a day without any rest. So, cooks work in shifts, which usually means that they will keep the galley open for the entire duration of the trip. This can be extremely tough considering how often things need to be cleaned and then the cooking starts. A cook aboard an aircraft carrier is perhaps one of the hardest working individuals, and without them, no one truly knows what would happen with the vessel. It is not like each sailor can quickly make a meal for themselves, or could they? Well, there is a supermarket aboard these vessels that add to the value they provide. One of the biggest additions to aircraft carriers in recent years is giving sailors access to other kinds of products. Instead of becoming institutionalized by rinsing and repeating the same routine, they have the luxury of visiting a supermarket that is usually present aboard these vessels. Inside, you won't be greeted with something as complex as Walmart, but rather a small supermarket that you usually find in the middle of a downtown area. Its main purpose is to sell some essential items that the sailors might need, and whatever they can find to make the travel and the long stint away from home a little more manageable. As mentioned, these stores have a lot of items sailors could want, but not everyone will be able to access one. Since shifts are designed to keep the vessel active 24/7, some sailors will need to skip out on these luxury items, unless they make a deal with someone to buy them something. The shop itself doesn't operate 24/7, simply because only one or perhaps two people are assigned to manage it. These sailors also need a bit of sleep. This initially proved a big problem, with sailors not always having access to buying some essential items. Fortunately, the U.S. Navy has taken note of this, and recently, these carriers have been upgraded to bring self-checkout stores to the vessel. Nowadays, sailors can finish their shift and simply pop into the store at any time of day or night. Once inside, they simply pick up these items and then head to the checkout. From here, the funds are either deducted from their pay, or they directly pay for each thing bought. But what do they buy inside these stores? Well, for the most part, the store is stocked with only the bare basics. Yes, you can find a brand new toothbrush, some ramen noodles, a few snacks, and energy drinks. Yes, these stores have a lot of energy drinks to fuel sailors who are working these incredibly long hours without any real break. As for clothing, the occasional branded item will hit the shelves, and sailors can either buy these for themselves or to take home to friends and family. But the second most bought item at the supermarket is none other than cleaning and hygiene products. Don't have any toothpaste? Well, don't worry. The store has you sorted. You can even buy some deodorant to help get rid of that smell if 6 men are living in the exact same compartment. Finally, many of those working on the vessel also need some electronics, like headphones to break away from the constant clattering of steel and aircraft either landing or taking off. Mobile chargers have recently become another great commodity. In fact, losing your charger can be detrimental on board a ship, and you cannot quickly pop out to your local Apple iStore and have it replaced. But even though not real food items like meat or fresh veggies are available in the store, it is still absolutely essential that every product is kept fresh. And with more than 6,000 sailors, you can bet that these items don't last very long. One of the main reasons for this store is the psychological effects it has on those aboard. For example, many of these sailors will not have access to common U.S. food items for up to a year, and this can be quite demoralizing, especially if you start longing for home. So, the U.S. Navy decided that giving officers the opportunity to buy some of the smaller things they might need could be very useful. For example, a sailor who feels like having a pudding cup or even just a heartwarming snack can now just pop into the store, take one, and they should be set. It doesn't sound like much when you are sitting at home watching these vessels operate on the big ocean. But when you are the one who must spend months away from your family, every small addition to make life easier could work. The store also serves a secondary purpose, and that is to feed sailors who don't have time to make it to the mess halls for the meals. Each store will sell things like ramen noodles that can quickly be heated, and you have a very decent meal that should sustain you for a couple of hours. Moreover, some aircraft carriers have gone a step further, introducing a Starbucks aboard. Yes, you heard that correctly. Starbucks is on board many Navy vessels and gives crew the opportunity to have a very expensive and sugary coffee. Although, prices are much more affordable at a Starbucks on these vessels, since most of it is funded by the United States government. While the Starbucks might not have the same illustrious menu you'd find back home, it does offer up some of the essentials. Your best-selling items will be available, which means that each morning sailors could quickly head out to Starbucks and get some caffeine to ready them for the day. Moreover, it also becomes the spot where everyone comes together to spend some time and catch up. You need to understand that an aircraft carrier is a literal floating city, and many of these sailors, despite being friends, can go months without seeing one another. You usually just operate and move between your cabin and your job. No one has time for something else, which is why loneliness quickly sets in with these sailors. Yes, many do suffer from depression due to loneliness, despite being fully surrounded by many other crew members. But when visiting these stores, the sailors never use real money. One of the latest innovations levied by the Navy is the introduction of these self-checkout stores. It was first introduced on the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower and has since turned into one of the biggest things the Navy has ever offered. The move became a revolutionary introduction to these ships, and instead of having someone constantly manning a till, sailors can now enter the store whenever they want. While the micromarket at sea initiative started before self-checkout stores, it would make a big difference for these sailors. Now, instead of worrying about cash, sailors can load funds onto a special card. This card is then used to swipe or tap at any of these convenience stores, where the funds will be automatically deducted and transferred over to a special fund for the ship. Yes, each ship has its own special fund, mostly directed at sailors and to make as many quality-of-life improvements aboard these vessels as possible. But the problem was that you still needed someone to work the till and to make sure everyone paid before they left. This has led the U.S. to introduce a self-checkout system, which works very similarly to stores with the same operating principle on U.S. soil. The sailor can now take the items, scan them, and simply pay before walking out. Smaller security measures to ensure theft doesn't happen has also been implemented. It has significantly sped up the queues in these stores, which can become rather cumbersome given the fact that everyone wants to get a slice of some true American flavor. The self-checkout means the store can operate 24 hours each day, and even those who have just finished their duty will be able to grab a bite to eat. Moreover, the funds generated through selling some of these products are not going to the United States government. Many of you might be thinking that this is another ploy to get some money to plug the $1 trillion budget the military is given. In fact, all the money made from these sales will go directly back to the sailors. One such method is through UNREP, as we mentioned earlier, but we will get into how they make sure supplies don't run out in just a little bit. Profits are used to make more quality of life improvements. For example, Thanksgiving might be on the horizon, and the carrier might make some of these funds available to buy different food items that are more conducive to what a Thanksgiving meal might look like. Essentially, these funds are spent on things like different food items. They can be used to bring in some movie equipment and allow those off duty to perhaps watch a movie with fellow crew members. So, the more funds sailors spend at this small store, or at a Starbucks, the more they get back when the Navy decides to do something special. The only problem is that when you have 6,000 sailors aboard a vessel, it can be very tedious to ensure these stores are fully stocked. As we alluded to earlier, one of the biggest issues with an aircraft carrier is keeping the vessel stocked. When you have more than 6,000 sailors working and needing their basic needs met, supplies can run dry very quickly, especially when everyone is using the store to buy their favorite treats. Fortunately, the Navy has this covered, and thanks to UNREP, supplies usually make it to the vessel every few couple of weeks. So, this means that if something runs out, you might need to wait a few days for it to return to the store, but at least you don't need to wait a couple of months for this to happen. UNREP usually involves a vessel with cargo moving to the aircraft carrier, with the attempt to shift the items on board to the other vessels. Once the cargo ship arrives, and its escort peels off to wait for the unloading, it will pull up right next to the carrier. No one is slowing down, as there is no time for stopping. High-tension cables are strung between both these vessels, and the cargo is transferred across. Sailors will help with packing, and some heavy lifting equipment might be needed for some of the stock. Usually, it will all be put in a central location or storage room, allowing the store operators and the chefs to simply just head to the storeroom and get whatever they need for cooking. Unlike submarines, which do not have the luxury of resupply, sailors will always get a fresh meal. On the contrary, submariners will get fresh meals for about 2 weeks before they need to start moving to food sources that can be stored for a longer period. But UNREP doesn't only involve food being procured and delivered to the ship. Judging by the USS Carl Vinson and USS Harry S. Truman in the Red Sea, military assistance is also very important. The carrier itself might not need to be refueled, but those fighters that take to the sky burn through quite a lot of fuel. But instead of using cargo ships, the Navy might simply charter an oil tanker to deliver large quantities of fuel to the ship. Finally, military equipment needs to be replaced. Even when the vessel is not in direct combat, it still needs to do a lot of training, and it is this training that drains some of the ordnance. But such ordnance is extremely heavy, and using high-tension cables might not be sufficient to get it onto the other vessels. Fortunately, each aircraft carrier also has a helicopter, and this will spring into action. The helicopter will fly these small sorties, picking up ammo from one side and dropping it on the carrier where it is to be sorted. This greatly eliminates the risk of using the high-tension cables, but what it doesn't do is eliminate the risk of the transfer. Yes, these carriers are usually at their most vulnerable when resupplying. The vessels cannot make sudden turns, and it needs to respect the capabilities of the cargo vessel resupplying it. Fortunately, there is an entire carrier strike force that usually stands alongside the vessel, and it is mainly responsible for the safety and security of the carrier. With the latest in radar and detection and armed to the teeth, no one would dare even challenge one of these carrier strike groups, especially when it is ready for combat. Such a scenario of replenishment can take a couple of hours when the ship is in this vulnerable position, but once everything has been transferred to the vessel, It doesn't take a lot of time for the carrier to be back and ready for action. Sailors will sort through the supplies and determine where everything goes, while ammo stockpiles will be refilled for further combat. If we look at a situation like that of the two carriers in the Red Sea, it becomes even more daunting to undertake these missions. There have been 2 reports already suggesting that the Houthis have shot at the carriers, but many of these attempts have failed, ensuring that sailors and the carrier itself are safe. From here, it is all back to basics, and everyone aboard the vessel will return to their stations. But it is also worth noting that UNREP schedules can change, and it is not the same for every vessel. Those who are in direct or constant contact will need to take a different approach to replenishing supplies, as no one wants to make a ship vulnerable when it is already dealing with incoming fire. Moreover, these vessels will also need more frequent replenishment, but not food, and rather more ammunition. Another question that often gets missed by many is what happens when a sailor has special dietary needs. For example, someone who subscribes to the Muslim religion might not be able to eat pork, which means a specific menu for these sailors should be designed. Not everyone is the same, and while someone might prefer a steak, the other person could be on a fully vegan diet. Since the Navy doesn't discriminate, they need to make sure that food standards adhere to whatever it is a person must eat. As we mentioned earlier, a specialized menu is almost akin to what you'd expect from a hospital. Cooks need to prepare meals for specific sailors depending on their needs, which means that at least one vegan option will always be available from the galley. Moreover, medical requirements are also followed, but the Navy usually doesn't need to deal with anything serious aside from allergies. Yes, sailors are screened and vetted before each deployment to ensure they will be able to successfully survive the deployment. If someone is suffering from serious medical complications, the likelihood of them even being on the vessels is extremely low. As for allergies, well, these are usually special requests that the cooks need to deal with, can often be a real pain. However, it is necessary that each person gets the food they need to survive a 6-month stay aboard a U.S. naval vessel. Medical specialists are also on board, and these active personnel are trained both in combat and medical efficiency. They will deal with problems regarding food or when someone does have an allergic reaction. Moreover, a sailor can be extracted and transported to a real hospital if something happens that requires them to do so. Essentially, every person with realistic demands will find that their stay aboard the vessels is made as comfortable as possible. Unfortunately, the small sleeping quarters might be something you never get used to, but at least these sailors don't need to cuddle up with a pack of canned baked beans like those working aboard a submarine might need to. Moreover, the availability of fresh food is something sailors truly appreciate and keeps them in tip-top form, especially those who want to use the gym, which is present on some of the newer U.S. destroyers. So, is it fun to be deployed aboard a United States aircraft carrier? No matter how many quality of life improvements are made, it is still a very long time that these sailors need to spend away from their families. Deployment usually lasts between 9 and 12 months, but for some missions, many can be away from home for the better part of 18 months. The longing for friends and family members can be mitigated with video calls and speaking more frequently than they would back before technology became a big thing. So, for the most part, it is not something that sailors would choose from their own free will. They would much rather want to be home. Once you get used to it, though, it becomes a real job. Sailors spend most of their time either working or sleeping, and there is very little time for doing nothing. After a few months, you will become somewhat institutionalized, and this usually makes the transition back to normality quite a bit of a challenge when they arrive back home. Fortunately, these deployments are few and far between, and sailors usually have a couple of months to rest and recover following it. If something serious happens, like a medical emergency for someone back home, the military can grant a special leave of absence, but this doesn't mean the entire ship will turn around to drop someone off. As we have previously mentioned, many of these vessels also operate an emergency helicopter. If someone needs to get home quickly, the Navy could offer them a change of station. This can either be transferring the sailor to a vessel heading home, or they can be deployed to a special military base and phase out when these soldiers end their deployment. For example, if someone operating on the USS Harry S. Truman, currently stationed in the Red Sea, needs to get home, they could be transferred to Diego Garcia. This small U.S. and British base, located in the Chagos Archipelago, constantly needs resupply, and numerous aircraft enter the base to deliver new supplies. If a sailor needs to get back home, they can easily board one of these vessels and quickly be transported back to the United States. However, this is only for very rare and exceptional circumstances. Once a sailor gets back home, it will be another 18 months before their next deployment, which begs the question of what exactly these sailors are up to during this period. Well, sailors need to remain in optimal shape, which means that training, generally done at a base, will need to be attended. Sailors might even work to earn a promotion in rank, and they will be tasked with normal day-to-day or administrative tasks. But this doesn't matter to someone who hasn't seen their family in a few months. So, even though adding many of these additions can be somewhat expensive for the Navy, it does keep sailors in the optimal mindset to make the best of their time aboard a Navy aircraft carrier. So, the United States aircraft carriers are an absolute honor to work abroad, but it still takes a lot of mental fortitude to have a great trip. Do you think you can survive being deployed for a few months or even years? Let us know in the comments section below.